I hope you can all hear me. Once again, this is Ron Brown. I'm continuing this series on the great cities of the world. Today's topic is the great cities of Egypt. Just to forewarn you, I am hopefully going to be in Mexico for the month of January, although that is tentative depending on the pandemic and everything. But then I will be back at Hewlett-Woodmere in February when we will start again. So check the catalog and the newsletter from the library, and we have two talks scheduled already for February. So I will be back. Okay, so let's get going. Now, as usual, if you have questions or comments, you can use the chat line since everybody is muted, and Dean will handle the questions that you type in for the chat. And then at the end, we will unmute everybody and you can make comments and whatever. And I will hopefully be able to field all your questions. So let's get going. So you can see once again that this is the great cities of Egypt. I hope you can all see the screen well. From Tutankhamun until today. Now, Egypt is an interesting country for the simple reason that it has had many major cities that have reflected each of the great empires and dynasties. And as we'll see, even one heretical pharaoh built a whole new city to celebrate his new religion, which lasted until he died, and then it was totally destroyed. So unlike most countries that have had one great city, when you think of England, you think of London. When you think of France, you think of Paris. When you think of Germany, you think of Berlin. When you think of China, you think of Peking. But Egypt has had a succession of great cities, each testifying to a different era, a different civilization. So let's get going. Once again, we see the outline, the founding civilizations, a little bit of history of civilizations in general, and then Memphis. And this is not the Memphis in Tennessee. This is the Memphis in Egypt, the first great imperial city of Egypt. Then the city founded in honor of the one god Aten, which is no longer exists, heresy. Then the Greek Alexandria, the Muslim Cairo, and then Napoleon really spreading Egyptomania around Europe and even America. Then the British Egypt, and once again, Egyptian independence. So let's get going. Now, as you all know, Egypt is one of the great ancient civilizations of the planet. Babylon is considered the most ancient civilization. You see the picture there on the left, the hanging gardens of Babylon. The Indus Valley civilization, which is the founding civilization of the Indian subcontinent, Hinduism and Buddhism. Egypt, one of the great ancient civilizations going back 4,000 years BC. Israel with the Temple of Solomon, leaving behind the Jewish Bible, which is the source of both Christianity and Islam. And of course, Greece, the philosophers, rationalism, Greek architecture. China, another ancient civilization. In fact, China claims to be the most ancient continuously existing civilization. India, the founding of the Hindu civilization. And then other civilizations that we don't usually put in the same category. And these would be the Aztecs, the Mayas, and the Incas, the ancient civilizations of the Americas. So the world has been blessed, we can say, with a series of great civilizations. Now, each civilization is marked by a great city, whether it is considered sacred or whether it is considered a great city is irrelevant. But we identify each civilization with a great city. On the left, we see the eagle on a cactus with a rattlesnake in its mouth. This was the ancient prophecy of the Aztecs that they would roam the North and Central American continents until they stumbled upon an eagle sitting on a cactus with a rattlesnake in its mouth. Then they would know that that is their sacred promised city, and the Aztecs were the chosen people. And so Mexico City is not just a big giant city of 25 million people, but it is also the sacred city of the Aztecs. Below that, we see Salt Lake City, the great city of the Mormons, shown to Brigham Young by no less person than God himself. In the middle, we see Mecca, the great city of Islam. Of course, above that, we see Abraham being instructed that he would be the father of a great nation and that the land of Canaan would be their promised land. On the right, we see the legends of Atlantis, an entire fictional lost civilization. When I was in Paraguay a while back, I started searching for the lost city of Z, a famous lost city, capital of a great empire, somewhere in Paraguay or Brazil. And in theology, New Jerusalem, the city conquered by David and made glorious by Solomon. In fact, today, Passover meal says next year in Jerusalem. Once again, the sacred city of the Jewish civilization and the sacred city of Christian and Jewish religion, the New Jerusalem, which will descend from the heavens. And Thomas More even envisaged the perfect world as a city. And here we see his book, Utopia, which means nowhere, but his vision of a perfect earthly civilization would be a great city. And in fact, until today, cities have dominated thinking around the world. Washington, D.C., what did George Washington have in his mind when he built this great city on the Potomac? A city that would belong neither to the north nor to the south, but on the borderline between the two separate areas of the new 13 colonies. A brand new city built in Greek and Roman architecture to show the roots of American democracy were not in the Christian Bible or the Jewish Bible or the Quran or the European Middle Ages, but in Greek and Roman culture. In the middle, St. Petersburg, when Peter the Great wanted to drag Russia screaming and yelling into the modern world, he built a great city, brought in Italian architects and German engineers and Dutch builders for his new imperial city. Tel Aviv, the great city founded by Theodor Herzl as the city of spring, a new springtime for the Jewish people, liberated from the ghettos. They were going to have a city of beaches and discotheques and Dizengoff Street, a city to represent a new golden age of the Jews. Well, until today, new cities are being built. Below Tel Aviv, we see Astana, the brand new capital of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan had been dominated by Russia for centuries. Finally, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it got its independence. How did it celebrate its independence? A brand new city in the middle of the desert, ultra modern architecture looking toward the future. Same thing with Brasilia, a new capital of Brazil, built in the jungles, a new Brazil not tied to Europe, but a new world power. Abuja in Nigeria, slam dunk in the middle geographic center of this giant country, the most populous country in Africa, to unite all of the regions, all of the peoples in a brand new city. So cities are important for every civilization. And unlike most modern countries, which have had one capital or possibly two, Egypt has been blessed with many capitals. Being one of the most ancient civilizations on the world, it has passed through a multitude of empires, each one marked by a great city. Now, on the right, we see a map of Egypt. You see the delta, the green area at the top, jutting out into the Mediterranean, and the fertile land along either side of the Nile. In the middle, you see what they call Lower Egypt, which is the delta, and Upper Egypt, which is in the interior. Well, Memphis was the most ancient capital of Egypt. And if you look at the center picture, you see Memphis right smack in the middle of the picture. It was built as the capital to show the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, the Egypt of the lush delta and the Egypt of the narrow Delta Valley. So it was built at the juncture between the North and the South, much like Washington was built at the meeting point of the northern colonies and the southern slave colonies. It was Narmer who united Upper and Lower Egypt in approximately the year 3100 BC, before Christ, or BCE, before the Common Era. And this marked what is called the First Dynasty, the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. So what did Narmer do to celebrate his great victory, the unification of all of Egypt? Well, of course, he built his new imperial city called Memphis. Now, the unification of Egypt is really very important. In fact, in the upper picture, you see Lower Egypt, the delta with the red crown, Upper Egypt, the white dome-like crown, and Narmer, when he united the two, simply took both crowns, placed one within the other, and that is the crown of the ancient pharaohs, showing the unity of Upper and Lower. And on the right, we see the two parts of Egypt united under Narmer as a new Egypt. Well, it was significant that the unification of Upper and Lower brought the mingling of two different people. As a picture in the middle, whenever you look at temple inscriptions in Egypt, you always see the mixing of African, Black African races and Northern Semitic races, and basically every color in between. And when I was in Egypt, I was shocked that you'd see blonde hair, blue-eyed Northerners. You would see very dark-skinned Southerners, and everybody and every shade in between. So Memphis was the first capital of this new united empire? Well, of course, when you see Memphis, not far away are the great pyramids of Saqqara and Giza. And so from Memphis, the pharaohs would take the bodies of their dead and they would build the great pyramids in a basically an urban cemetery. In fact, when I was in Egypt, I mean, the distances are pretty small. I mean, from Memphis, you could almost walk to Giza and then even on to Cairo. The pyramid, the very first step pyramid, of Djoser dates from approximately 2600 BC or BCE. So this city was a celebration of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. The pyramids, famous pyramids, the Giza pyramids, the Sphinx, were the burial grounds of these ancient first dynasty pharaohs. On the left, you see me standing, climbing up on one of the pyramids. That's a nice thing about traveling in the 70s. You could still climb the pyramids in both Egypt and in Mexico. Last time I was in Mexico climbing the pyramids, you couldn't anymore. But back then, you could. So Memphis was the glorious city of the new Egyptian empire of the first dynasty. Now, the city itself has had an influence. In fact, for some obscure reason, I don't know why, when Tennessee was emerging from a territory and becoming an actual state, it built the city of Memphis. And it was sort of like you have Rome, New York, and you have Berlin, Pennsylvania. Immigrants brought their famous cities with them. I don't know if Egyptians settled in Memphis, Tennessee, but they adopted the city as a symbol of Egypt. And in fact, the picture on the left, you see the Memphis Zoo, all built with obelisks and Egyptian temples. And you see, Memphis is on the Mississippi River, which may be a reason why Memphis was chosen as the name of the city as the great port city on the river. Well, Memphis remained the great first imperial capital of Egypt, celebrated around the world as one of the great world empires, along with China and India, and later Rome and Greece and Babylon. Well, another event happened when we had a pharaoh called Akhenaten, who ruled from 1351 to 1336. Now, he was, as you can see from the sculpture on the left, physically very strange. Very long, narrow face. His hips were very broad. Some people said he was deformed or whatever, but in spite of all of that, he was one of the greatest theologians of ancient Egypt. He rejected for the very first time all of the gods of Egypt, thousands of gods, as well as the gods of the Babylonians and the Greeks and the Chinese and the Indians and every other group. He is the father of monotheism. Well, to celebrate his new revelation, the rule of the one God, the God Aten, he built a brand new imperial city to celebrate the revelation of monotheism, one God. Now, of course, most Egyptians considered him a heretic rejecting all the ancient gods of the Egyptians who had ruled over Egypt for thousands of years. Basically, they said, who the hell is this guy to reject thousands of years of history? Well, his one single god was the sun god. You see the carving on the right. We see Akhenaten worshiping the sun god. Well, of course, Memphis was filled with ancient Egyptian temples, as was every other city. So he built a brand new imperial city called Amarna. Now, we know a lot about this because he was a great theologian, a great writer, established a new priesthood to the one and only God. And on this map, we see that Memphis was abandoned. We see Memphis and Cairo at the top of the picture. And then further down the Nile into the heart of Egypt, he built his new city of Amarna. The temple in the middle was absolutely massive. In fact, it was the largest temple ever built in Egypt because it combined all of the priesthoods and all of the rituals and everything were combined not in a plethora of temples and priesthoods, but in one official priesthood, one God. And it was interesting because this God was not worshipped in statues. It was banned to make statues of God because for this new religion of Akhenaten, their God was the sun. Now, the sun is very important in all religions. Why do we have Sunday and Monday, the day of the moon and the day of the sun? Because every religion has venerated the sun as the source of all life, whether it is declared a god or a great power. Ancient people made sacrifices as soon as the sun went down on the horizon because they weren't 100% sure that it would rise the next morning, which is why a solar eclipse was so important, because it warned people, hey, don't take the sun for granted. It might not always be there. Well, of course, when Akhenaten launched this new heresy, it was a scandal, vicious opposition. You can imagine all the priests and the priestesses and all of the temples which had filled Memphis and the other cities of Egypt were suddenly destroyed, and the priests found themselves unemployed, and the rise of a brand new religion. So as soon as Akhenaten died, his successor destroyed the city and returned to the ancient gods of Egypt. And so today, see the picture of the Amarna secret. What was the city like with this giant temple, the largest temple ever built by humans? It became a lost city in the desert. In fact, for centuries, successive pharaohs had destroyed any memory of Akhenaten and destroyed his city, and it went back to the sands of the desert. But Amarna had a very powerful influence on world religions. The city was destroyed. The pharaoh's memory was destroyed on the faces of temples and obelisks and inscriptions. But many people attribute the rise of monotheism in Egypt as the inspiration for monotheism among the Hebrew people. Moses in Egypt, 1391, corresponded to the reign of Akhenaten. It is believed that Moses may have visited the great city of Amarna and been influenced by this belief in one God, God who does not demand sacrifices, gods which do not tolerate statues and graven images. So many scholars argue that the birth of Jewish monotheism is traced back to the lost city of Amarna. In fact, a whole literature has been written on the influence of Moses and Akhenaten. Sigmund Freud's famous book, Moses and Monotheism, strongly argued that the belief in one God in Judaism can be traced back to Akhenaten. Moses and Akhenaten, the secret history of Egypt at the time of the Exodus, or Akhenaten and the origins of monotheism. Well, monotheism was viciously stamped out in Egypt. And who did it? Well, you might not remember the name Akhenaten, but you're sure going to remember the name Tutankhamun. It was Tutankhamun, the son of Akhenaten, who rejected his father's heretical teaching of one God and did everything he could to wipe out his memory and the teaching of this heresy. And when the tomb of Tutankhamun was discovered in 1922, it had not been touched. A famous King Tut's tomb and mummy had survived thousands of years of neglect and had not been looted, and everything was intact. So that is the second great city of Egypt, much less known, but many people like Sigmund Freud would argue the most important imperial city in Egypt as far as world religions are concerned. Well, another great city of Egypt corresponded to another glorious epoch of European history. Alexander the Great, who came to power and ruled in the 300s BC, BCE, has conquered not only his home of Macedonia, but most of Greece, modern day Turkey, the land of Canaan, Israel, Egypt, Babylon, Syria, Jordan, the whole way into Persia, up into Afghanistan, Pakistan. And he only stopped going when his troops said, well, we're not going to cross the Indus River and go into India. We have enough of an empire. Well, wherever he went, Alexander, in all humility, established brand new Greek-speaking cities, which in all humility, he named Alexandria. Now, Donald Trump builds buildings, and Paul calls them Trump Tower and Trump Casino and everything. But Alexander went one step further and built entire cities called Alexandria. There's the Alexandria in Afghanistan, several in Pakistan, in Persia, the Alexandria in Egypt on the coast. Now, this was the first of the Egyptian great cities that was built on the coast, because the establishment of the city brought Egypt into the global trading system of the Mediterranean. So Egyptians built fleets and went sailing off into Italy, to Spain, to North Africa, up into modern day Turkey, back then Cappadocia, and built the great city of Alexandria. Now, in Arabic, they don't call it Alexandria, it's called Il Skandaria, which is how Arabs would pronounce Alexandria. Until today, it exists as one of the great Western looking cities of Egypt. If Memphis was deeply Egyptian, where the Nile met the Delta, and where Amarna was a theological city even further into the mainland of Egypt, Alexandria was on the coast. It inaugurated a whole new era in Egyptian history. Now, every city has a meaning. On the right, you see Washington, D.C., uniting the northern colonies with the South, a neutral zone between the slave-holding South and the anti-slave-holding North. Brasilia, once again, turned its back on Portugal and Europe and said Brazil is a new emerging world empire. Abuja in Nigeria was built to reconcile the Muslim north of Nigeria and the Christian south, a neutral ground. And the other cities of Europe all had a special meaning. When Ferdinand and Isabel got married, they established their new capital is Madrid, geographically in the center of Spain. Peter the Great transferred the capital from Moscow in the heart of Russia to the coastal area to show the links with Western Europe. Well, Alexandria was very much like St. Petersburg. It was the Egyptian window to the outside world. It was dominated by the great lighthouse to guide the ships into the harbor of Alexandria. On the right, we see the glorious Library of Alexandria, the largest library ever built on the face of the earth, where the Greeks brought the great learning of the whole world. They brought the teachings of Persia, of India, of Greece and Rome and Egypt and Ethiopia and of Israel to this library. Well, in the middle picture, you see the new Library of Alexandria, once again claiming to be the meeting point between the ancient Egyptian civilization and the rest of the world. Now, Alexandria was also important because, as we go into the story of Christmas these days, the book of Matthew talks about when King Herod of Israel was persecuting the babies born because he believed that Jesus or a baby was born who would take his throne and be declared the king of the Jews. So King Herod ordered all of the babies of Israel to be massacred, hopefully to eliminate a claimant to his throne. Well, as all good Christians know, Mary and Joseph were forewarned by an angel and they fled to Egypt. Well, unlike the picture which you see with the pyramids, the Jesus and Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus did not go to Cairo, which didn't exist. They didn't go to Memphis, and they didn't go to Amarna. They went to Alexandria. Now, why would they do that? Well, because Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were all Jews. And Alexandria was the largest Jewish city in the world at the time of the Roman Empire, and the birth of Jesus. So many Jews had migrated from Israel because of the first diaspora and then later persecutions by the Romans that the Jewish quarter in Alexandria was the largest Jewish city in the world. So it was natural that Jesus and Mary would go to the Jewish quarter where everybody spoke Aramaic, and there were synagogues all over the place. The library was there, and they would be received well. In fact, it was in Alexandria where the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, the so-called Septuagint, because at the time of Jesus, nobody spoke Hebrew anymore. It was already a dead language. Jesus and Mary spoke Aramaic, and the cultural language of the Jews, the educational language by that time, had to become Greek. So the synagogues of Alexandria were in Greek. Well, Alexandria, as the window of Egypt to the world, of course, attracted the Romans and Caesar and Cleopatra, Antony and Cleopatra, and all of those stories. They are all focused on Alexandria. And Cleopatra, the last queen who tried to keep Egypt independent or autonomous under the Romans, ended up failing, and Egypt became a Roman province. Well, in the first centuries, Alexandria was still the largest city in Egypt, the most cosmopolitan, the most educated, the most sophisticated. And so when Egypt started converting to Christianity under the Coptic Church, the cathedral of the Coptic Christians was in Alexandria. And the Coptic Church, which spread down the Nile from Egypt to Sudan and up into Ethiopia, was one of the great Christian churches, along with Constantinople, which was the head of the Greek Orthodox Church, Rome, the Roman Catholics, Armenians and Georgians, and Cairo for the Christians of Egypt. We tend to forget that at the time, following the centuries after Christ, the predominant religion of Egypt was Coptic Christianity. Today, there are approximately 12 million members of the Egyptian Coptic Church with their own traditions. They still worship, they still say Mass in the ancient language of the pharaohs, which is their liturgical language. And in the picture on the left, you see the distinctive hats of the Coptic bishops. The bishop on the right with a pointed cap, that is a traditional Armenian bishop. This is a large Armenian community in Alexandria. On the right, you see the interior of a Coptic church with Jesus and the angels and Mary and other holy personages. Well, in about 640, another great city was founded in Egypt, which dominated Egypt from the 600s until today. And this was the Muslim conquest of Egypt. Muslims leaving Mecca and Medina. The dark green area was Muslim by the time 632, when the Prophet Muhammad died. And after that, Islam spread up into Egypt, Baghdad, up across North Africa, Spain, and into India and Turkey. Well, the Muslims, when they conquered, they really didn't feel attracted to Alexandria, which was too worldly and cosmopolitan. Plus, it was a center of Christianity and was filled with Jews as well. Memphis was sort of a neglected city of tombs and ancient temples. Amarna was lost and long forgotten. And so the Egyptians built a brand new city called Il Kahiratu in Arabic, which means the victorious, celebrating the victory of Islam over the people of Egypt. A brand new city built in the desert to celebrate a new civilization being born, filled with magnificent mosques. Once again, we see the mosque on the right with the towers and the domes. Now, Egypt, as a sidebar, has many names. First on the right, you see me at the top of a house with some of my Egyptian friends years ago. And at the next picture, that's me on the Nile getting a boat ride with a guy who had basically a rowboat. Well, Egypt is a name that was given to Egypt by the Greeks and the Romans, Aegyptos in Greek, Aegyptus in Latin. The ancient people called their country Kemet, which means the people of the black soil of the Delta and the Nile. In Arabic, the country was renamed Misr, which is the name that is used in the Hebrew Bible as well. In Hebrew, it's Mitzrayim. That should be Hebrew Bible. And in fact, there is a theory that because of the slavery suffered by the Hebrew people in Egypt, that the word misery is evolved from the Arabic word misr, although I haven't seen any concrete proof for that. Well, Cairo was elaborated, built, mosques, Al-Azhar University, which you see on the right-hand side, founded in 970, was the oldest Islamic university in the world. As long as the Arabs were in Saudi Arabia and the towns of Mecca and Medina, which were relatively backward, they weren't too interested in academic studies. But when they conquered Egypt, they came in contact with Greeks and with Christians and Armenians and Jews and the library and the Egyptians. Even when they converted and joined Islam, they brought their philosophical interests, scientific interests with them. And so Al-Azhar was an Egyptian contribution to Islam. The citadel was built in the late 1100s, a fortified city with walls and gates, and once again with the mosques and the towering minaret, which are still really a delight to see in Cairo until today. The Jews remained in Egypt, a very important part of the population, because the Muslims considered Jews and Christians, as well as Zoroastrians, as monotheists, having one God. Moses Maimonides, Ben Maimon, born in Spain and ended up settling in Cairo, where he lived for the large part of his life. And there you see the Maimonides synagogue and the statue of Maimonides until today. Well, when the Ottoman Turks took over and added Egypt to their empire, they, of course, retained Cairo, the uniquely Muslim city of Egypt, as their own capital. Muhammad Ali became the ruling pasha in the early 1800s. And like so many Muslims, he was from Albania up in Europe, became a general in the Turkish army and seized power in Egypt. In fact, he adorned Cairo with its most beautiful mosque, and this is the Muhammad Ali Mosque of 1848. And you can see it's surrounded by its own wall, and the interior is ornately decorated with geometric patterns, circles, triangles, all kinds of geometric decorations, because Muslims, like Jews, are not allowed to make representations of human beings, whether it's painting or statues or art. And so the emphasis is on calligraphy, which would be Arabic writing, and on geometric patterns inside the domes. Well, Cairo remained the focus of the real Egypt. Alexandria was always very cosmopolitan, Western, secular, sort of like Tel Aviv is in Israel. Well, Cairo was the Egyptian Jerusalem, more focused on religion, on ancient monuments, on more religious culture. Well, when Napoleon was emerging still as a general, he decided to add Egypt to his growing empire, not just growing in Europe, the European empire, but he thought that if he could take Egypt, that would be the springboard between Europe and Asia. There was a real competition between Britain and France about who was going to control Egypt. Well, Napoleon organized a host of generals, military people, but also took archaeologists and anthropologists to study the ancient civilization of Egypt. And they say that Napoleon was so impressed with Egypt that he even thought of staying there and never returning to France. Think what we would have lost. Emperor Napoleon and the war in Russia and everything else. But from 1798 to 1801, he occupied Egypt and he explored, made meticulous drawings. Unfortunately, they didn't have photographs back then, but did a real scientific and archaeological study of this ancient civilization. Well, as you know, he discovered the Rosetta Stone, which dated from 196 BCE. And this stone was so important because, as you can see in the picture on the right, the top third was written in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, which at the time of Napoleon, nobody could read. The middle section was in Demotic script, which means ancient Egyptian writing, but written in simplified letters, which people could read at that time. And the bottom was written in Greek. So they would read the Greek, they would understand what it meant. They would link it up with the Demotic script and find out how it was pronounced in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, and then they could read the hieroglyphics themselves. So this was one of the greatest discoveries in ancient Egypt carried out by Napoleon. Well, this unleashed a ravishing rage of Egyptomania around Europe, even extending into America. Here at the bottom left, we see the famous tombs of New York, the most infamous prison in Lower Manhattan. On the right, we see the New York Reservoir, which stands where the New York Public Library is, built in the Egyptian style. Everybody wanted a living room or a dining room or a salon in the Egyptian style. Louis Comfort Tiffany was fascinated by Egypt. And he not only designed entire homes in this Egyptian revival style, jewelry, lamps, carpets, furniture, but he even went to Egypt and spent several years painting scenes from Egypt. And on the right, we see one of Louis Comfort Tiffany's famed paintings of the Muhammad Ali Mosque and the tombs of the Mamluks beside it. We don't think of Louis Comfort Tiffany as being a great painter, but he really brought back a wealth of knowledge of this rich and ancient culture. The French, of course, went crazy. You have the Place de Concorde with the obelisk on the right, so-called obelisk of Cleopatra. One of them was even brought to New York and stands in the backyard of the Metropolitan Museum. Artificial little obelisks with clock towers and all kinds of decorations for the home, mostly created by Louis Comfort Tiffany and other aficionados of this new raging Egyptian style. Well, very important was November 17, 1869, when finally the Suez Canal was opened. The rivalry between Britain and France to control Egypt was not so much about Egypt, but about building a canal. So you could go from Europe through the canal and directly to Asia without going around the bottom of Africa. It was built by the French and then eventually taken over by the British. Well, Egypt continued to be important in history. It was the British Empire which took over Egypt beginning in 1882 and ruled Egypt until 1956. A picture on the left shows the British Empire, when the sun never set on the British Empire, from New Zealand and Australia through Burma and India and Pakistan, big chunk of Africa, even Canada and colonies in the Caribbean and South America. Egypt was a centerpiece in this because with the canal, you could go from Britain through the Straits of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean, through the canal or down the Red Sea, and you had all of the Indian Ocean at your feet. And so the British placed great emphasis on the city of Cairo. They adopted it as their major city. They built the great Egyptian Museum, which you see in the center picture, combining sort of Arabic-looking architecture and mosaics. On the right, you see the Egyptian Museum, which opened in 1902, really bringing Egyptian architecture and archaeology into the modern age. The British also built the Cairo Railroad Station, and the English placed great emphasis on the railroad station of Cairo because their plan was to go from Cairo down through the heart of Africa, the whole way to Johannesburg in South Africa, a Trans-Africa Railroad ending at Cairo, and that opened in 1892. Well, with the British occupation, there was a big European influence, including American influence in Cairo. Now, my favorite hangout when I was in Cairo was the Café Groppi. Groppi was a Swiss Italian who got tired, I guess, of living in Switzerland and took off and opened up his cafe in 1909. And this was the hangout, Art Deco architecture, as you can see, the hangout of the foreigners in Egypt. I met so many wonderful people in Egypt, and just foreigners, well-to-do Egyptians, businessmen from all over the world, and it was really the place to be. Well, as Egypt started chafing under British rule and demanding independence, there was a turn back to the original function of Cairo as the Islamic heart of Egypt. Well, as Egypt started agitating for independence from Britain, of course, it was the motto was back to the Islamic origins of Cairo. Well, at the time in the 1940s and 50s, as Egypt was approaching independence, there were 80,000 Jews in Egypt. There were several million Christians. And there was pressure on both Christians and Jews, to say nothing of Greeks and Armenians, to get out of Egypt. Most of the Egyptian Jews ended up migrating to the United States, Britain, and later to Israel. The Christians largely to Britain, some to France, and others to the United States. But Egypt was not the only country demanding an ethnically pure nation state. Egypt said the Christians and Jews should get out because Egypt will henceforth be an Islamic republic. Iraq followed with the expulsion and flight of 140,000 Jews. When Turkey got its independence, it expelled and massacred about 1.5 million Armenians. Almost 1 million Greeks were either expelled or massacred from Turkey. When Israel got its independence in 1948, 800,000 Palestinian Christians and Muslims were either expelled or fled from Israel. So Egypt was part and parcel of this rise of ethnic nationalism in the Middle East. Alexandria lost the vast majority of its Jews, large numbers of its Christians, almost all the Greeks and Armenians and Europeans. In fact, my favorite coffee shop, the Groppi in Cairo, was the owner, the Swiss owner, Groppi, was actually expelled from Egypt, and his cafe was confiscated by the government. I've heard that it has since been returned, but this is part and parcel of what was happening in the 1940s. Turkey should be 100% Turk Muslim. Iraq should be 100% Iraqi Muslim. Egypt should be 100% Egyptian Muslim. Israel should be 100% Jewish. And so this was this rise of militant nationalism throughout the Middle East. And in Egypt, non-Muslims were restricted from voting, severe restrictions on land ownership. They were restricted on building houses of worship, that should be worship, and they were often required to pay a special tax. So Cairo, and especially Alexandria, ended up losing its cosmopolitan character. Very often the synagogues and the churches would remain, but more or less as empty memorials. Nasser came to power, ruled from 56 to 1970, when the last of the Jews, most of the Christians, Greeks, and Armenians were finally forced out in a process of Egyptianization. He tried to nationalize the Suez Canal, eventually succeeded, and launched a war against Israel, the Six-Day War, where he was defeated and Israel seized the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Now, the future of Cairo. Cairo is the heart of Egypt. It is now 21 million people and growing rapidly. Very high birth rate in Egypt. I remember when I was there, you would never see older people. The vast majority of the people were young people. I mean, they were in their late teens and 20s. Massive migration from Egypt to Saudi Arabia, Dubai, the Persian Gulf countries, to Europe, to the United States, in Brooklyn on Atlantic Avenue. They call it Little Egypt because of so many Egyptians settling there. You see the picture in the middle of the booming modern city of Cairo. So it is one of the most wonderful and fascinating countries in the world to visit, Egypt, because of its diversity of major great cities, each one communicating a very different chapter in the history of Egypt. So once again, this is Ron Brown. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send me an email at ronbrownmedia@gmail.com. Once again, there's me when I looked probably in my late 20s when I was living in Switzerland and spent my Swiss francs in Egypt. And that's what I look like today here in New York. So if you have any questions or comments,